Hey, Gleb Alexandrov here, and in this tutorial we're gonna come up with a formula for beautiful cinematic lighting for the object shots of any kind. We're gonna start from scratch and then gradually explore all the steps of this formula so it can be applied to a variety of different locations and shots. This formula is extremely versatile. After setting it all up, its components can be mixed to your taste and adapted to the needs of the project, no matter if it's a dramatic, moody composition or an upbeat and evocative still life. To not reinvent the wheel and keep it simple, you can reuse the components of this scheme or this formula in your own work. So our subject, or rather object for demoing this lighting scheme, is gonna be this bunch of minerals. It is a nice little object that has variety of textural details and has a little bit of everything in terms of materials. It is fairly reflective, but not super reflective at the same time. It shows a fair bit of variable roughness, so it's neither super glossy nor super diffuse. It even allows a bit of light to pass through it with the help of the subsurface scattering, which we will discuss a bit later on. So as I've said, it's a little bit of everything. It's a perfect demo object for this kind of lighting setup. Now an important note. Even though the subsurface scattering looks beautiful, for the purpose of the tutorial, to keep things simple, I guess, we will turn it off. So once you open the demo scene in Blender, you will find out that the subsurface is turned off, is switched off. It'll make our minerals look like they're made of clay, which is perfect for our training purposes. So let's keep moving. Okay, before actually getting our hands dirty, we should probably set our Blender up, our Cycles up, and have a look at the scene. But why do we use Cycles render engine for this lighting tutorial? First of all, it is a pure path tracing render engine, which means it's the closest we can get in Blender to the way light actually behaves in the real world. With Cycles, the light just behaves realistically right out of the bat, so we don't have to even think for the most part about global illumination and other realistic lighting effects, so we can focus on what truly matters, which is creating cinematic and yet believable lighting. Thanks to the recent advancements in Blender, such as general speedup and denoising, ray-traced rendering became much faster than it used to be. In the old days, one frame of path-traced animation could easily take a few days to render, but fortunately, these days are over. And with the rise of GPUs and the advancements in technology, the viewport rendering and Blender as well became a thing. In other words, we'll leave the burden of technical lighting calculations to Cycles and focus on the creative side of it. Once you open the demo file, you will see a bunch of minerals arranged on the table, and that's how it should look. But first, let's jump over to Preferences and make sure that within the system settings, we have our GPU visible. We can tell that my render device, which is NVIDIA, the GPU, got recognized. There are different options available for accelerating ray tracing, such as CUDA and optics, with optics being available on NVIDIA GPUs only, and being the fastest option that I know. Then if you own one of the AMD graphics cards, you'll be able to choose the HIP instead. But I'll stick to optics though currently. Okay, throughout the tutorial we're gonna use Cycles render engine to keep things slightly more streamlined and realistic right out of the box. So within the render engine drop-down menu, I'm selecting Cycles and making sure that the device is set to GPU compute. GPUs render much faster in Cycles than CPUs generally. What I usually like to do when dealing with lighting is create two windows, one for the final render view, which will use the rendered mode of the viewport, and the second one at the top for the material preview. Here we got our camera through which we will see our final shot, our render. Now the render icons are located at the top of the user interface of the viewport. There we can change it from the default shading mode to the material preview one and to the rendered mode, which is right over there. It'll enable the Cycles path tracing rendering mode in this particular window, and we will use it throughout the tutorial, so let's keep it turned on. Depending on the video card, it can be rather slow or pretty fast, but let's keep it in the rendered mode for now. And the top one will be our material preview mode. To make sense of our scene, it will use some random HDRI included by default with Blender. But no matter the HDRI environment chosen though, the point of this viewport is to be our secondary monitor with the lights and the UI elements on all the time. That is our working environment decoupled from the Cycles rendered view, if that makes sense. If you don't want to use a generic HDRI there, you can switch on the scene world and scene lights, which will make it look fairly similar to the rendered mode, but I will disable all these options. I need this HDRI to just have enough information to see things clearly, because, you know, our bottom view will be constrained to what the camera sees, and it will be fairly slow and stuff like that. Okay, going over to the environment settings, we can tell that the only light source our scene has is this abstract gray environment. We can play with the exposure of this default Blender environment, but actually what I'll do is reduce it all the way down to 0 to start from scratch. Our cinematic method implies that we start from scratch anyway. Okay, so Blender cursor can serve as the spawning point for any kind of objects. So when I press Shift A and at the area light, it gets spawned just on top of 3D cursor. We can click and drag to make it larger or smaller. If we press T to open the left tool shelf and select the transform gizmo, you can actually use the handles of this gizmo to move, rotate, scale up and down our light source. But usually I like to do it in a slightly different way, utilizing Blender hotkeys. So G is to move the objects around. The movement can be constrained to X, Y, and Z axes by utilizing the X, Y, and Z keys. The same with rotations. R to rotate, X, Y, and Z afterwards to constrain it to a certain axis. And finally, the S shortcut scales the object. Not a whole lot of things to remember. G to move or grab, R to rotate, S to scale. It's good to remember these three. These shortcuts quickly become second nature for moving objects, in this case light sources, around. And when it comes to adjusting the light source settings, as a quick refresher, we have this green light bulb icon within the Blender user interface, and there we can access all the settings like the color, the power, the shape of the light source, the size, whatever else. Everything can be adjusted from there. Changing the size from that menu is practically the same as scaling the object. So it's interchangeable in this sense. And whatever you're gonna do, don't you dare unticking the Cast Shadows button in Cycles. Shadows are important. Okay, throughout the videos you will see me accessing the objects in either of these windows, sometimes in the rendered view, sometimes in the material preview. You will also notice me toggling off the visibility of the UI elements with this button in the rendered view. Sometimes the user interface can get in the way, especially when there's a lot going on in the viewport. So shutting the noisy UI elements up really helps to focus on what matters. What else do we have here? As for the camera, we have one here in the Camera 01 Outliner collection. We can press 0 on the numpad to jump into the camera view, or Ctrl 0 to make any camera the active one. A nice little hack in Cycles to juice slightly more performance out of it is to press Ctrl B and draw the rectangle around the viewport, or rather around the camera view, or actually around a portion of the camera view even. That would constrain the render region around that particular portion of the viewport, and within the view output properties you can see the render region checkbox that can be turned on and off. And basically that is it. Again, we can switch between the render modes using these icons, or we can press Z to bring up this pie menu, whatever feels more comfortable to you, I guess. So I think that should be it for the basic Blender setup. and for the settings that may come in handy throughout the tutorial. Once again, the render engine has been set to cycles, the device to GPU compute, to avoid any confusion. As for the light paths, there is no real need to adjust it. Well, maybe I'll limit the diffuse, glossy and transmission bounces a little bit to speed up the viewport. And this is it. I also have a personal superstition about increasing the indirect light clumping just in case, to not lose the precious rays generated by cycles. More about that later. I will show some comparisons and stuff like that. Now I'll just say that this is it for the boring part. The cycles is set up, the shortcuts are mentioned. Nothing stops us from diving deep into setting up lighting, so that is what we will do in a moment. And by the way, if you have any questions about setting up the blend file or accessing the project files, feel free to reach out to us or to other students of this particular course in our Discord. And now onto the exciting part, setting up the key lights or the main light. The key light is usually the brightest and the most visible light on set. Its purpose is to highlight the form and dimension of on-screen subjects. Without realizing it, we have already created one. So let's just promote it to the key light role and call it like that. I'm rotating it in such a way so it faces the camera and then extending it a little bit and making it way larger. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna position it on the other side of the scene, so we shoot in shadows, and it will become clear why in just a moment. For now, let's leave it there, make it relatively large, and then head over to the light settings menu and adjust its power. Now it's a little bit too weak to pretend to be the key light, so let's give it a boost. Well, it makes sense to talk about brightnesses or light ratios when there's more than one light in the scene, and we will talk about that, but so far I'm just trying to make it sufficiently bright. Now it packs a punch without going over the top in terms of brightness. It's sufficiently bright to serve as our main light. Then the next property that we're gonna adjust is its size, which directly connects to softness. The rule sounds like that: the smaller the light in proportion to the subject, the harder, and vice versa. The bigger the emission surface, the softer. Given the bigger source area, the transition between the light and the shadow becomes less sharp and less pronounced, and that is what we call soft. As usual, why not throw in a visual comparison? Soft light means a gradual transition between light and shadow. Hard light means razor-sharp shadows. But then it's all about the gradient between lit and shaded areas. The gradient that depends on the size of the light source. It's really easy to see how the gradient gets stretched on increasing the light size to the point of a super ambient and slightly flat lighting, and then on rolling the size back, it collapses a little bit. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to establish a neural link between the light size and softness and this gradient. Okay, what I usually like to do for moving the light source around is press dot and select 3D cursor as the pivot point. Alternatively, you can find it in this menu. By default, it's set to active element. We just change it to 3D cursor and then shift and right click on any kind of surface, and with the light source selected, press R and Z to constrain the rotation to the Z axis, and it will pivot around your 3D cursor. Isn't that great? So now it's time to talk about the direction of the light source, just after we have talked about the power and the softness. The direction means a lot in lighting. For example, now we have placed our light in a rather frontal way, and thus we have flattened the image quite a bit. More often than not, we don't want it. We don't want to flatten our stuff. By moving it off to the side, we make sure that the light is now splitting the object, so it got the much needed contrast between brightly lit and shadowy sides that is already in the zone of sculpting shape with light compared to more frontal light. So key light that comes in from the side is already more dynamic. in how it creates the shape and reveals the depth of the minerals and the stuff around it. It can be placed overhead for the top light, or moved to the side, or maybe you can place it directly on the opposite side in relationship to the camera. So it's now technically a backlight, even though it's a key light, our main dominant light that still creates most of the form and definition in the scene. And actually with this particular light placement, we now shoot in shadows. We shoot into shadow side, and that is called upstage lighting or reverse key lighting. And if there is one little thing that we can do to make our scenes more cinematic right away, is shooting into shadows. As simple as drawing the line and placing the key light on the opposite side from the camera. So now, even though the scene lacks any kind of fill, we can appreciate the transition between light and shadow, and all the shadows actually falling in the direction of the camera, which makes it look three-dimensional and great and cinematic. And actually, to prove this point in a fun way, let's select the camera and the key light and pivot it around our minerals. Funny enough, we can tell that by keeping the camera on the opposite side of our key light, we make sure that there is no flattening going on. It becomes hilariously hard to screw it up, right? It still feels pretty three-dimensional due to the key light position. To recap the placement of the key light, it's actually super important to consider to what extent does it actually help you to model the shape and dimension of your subject when it's placed on the camera side, when it's, let's say, kind of frontal. Or does it make more sense from the cinematic standpoint to highlight the shape and the object to actually push our key light to the opposite side of the scene? So we shoot into the shadow side, as it makes the light and shadow play much more dynamic. And 9 times out of 10, at least in my opinion, the reverse key lighting or the upstage lighting is much more cinematic in terms of revealing the form of the object indeed. Not to take away anything from the more frontal light projections, but undeniably they are a little bit flat sometimes, and it's good when you need such flatness for whatever purposes. But if your goal as a 3D cinematographer, as it happens, is to enhance the depth and enhance the dimension, that makes the reverse key lighting a no-brainer in my opinion. It works with the hard lights as well, it doesn't really matter. The overall direction from which the light hits the object matters the most here. The same principle would be the right word applies here. Not the hard-coded rule, and if it was the rule, it could be broken, but the principle. The frontal light has usually less dimension than the side light, or any other combination of the light hitting the object at an angle. And of course, it's all relative to the camera position, so if the camera switched sides, the light should jump to the other side of the scene as well to maintain the reverse key lighting. So that, I think, could be a key takeaway, no pun intended, for choosing the direction of your main light source. While we are on this page, let's talk about the light fall-off as well. The light fall-off is the effect of dimming of the light source depending on whether it's positioned close to the subject or further away. I mean, what would be the difference if we have pushed our main light further away into the background and compensated the size and the intensity? By the way, I'm utilizing the math expression within the power tab, multiplying by 50. Okay, we have pushed the key light further away and compensated the rest of its properties, but there is something going on with the light gradient, with the way, let's say, the light travels across the table. Compared to when the light was much closer, the light gradient on the table is not as prominent, and I would also say not as visually pleasing, although it is hard to put finger on what exactly has changed. We will need a better example for that in just a moment. Okay, let's Ctrl Z a few times to bring back the old position of the light source, where it was way closer to the minerals, before actually evaluating the comparison shot. I wonder, can you tell what has actually changed in between these two positions of the key light? what difference has the distance brought into this equation? Have a look at these two images. In one of these, the light was placed further away, with the power and the size adjusted accordingly, and in the right one, on the contrary, the light was placed as tight as possible to the subject. You know what? Let's have a look at the better example. Because the area light is way closer to the first sphere than to the last one, the first sphere receives more light. It's the effect of more rays hitting its surface, so as a result, it's better exposed. You can clearly tell the difference in exposures in between the spheres and on the floor, for that matter. As if the light gets dimmer as it travels across the floor, which is not true, obviously. The gradient of light and dark is simply a byproduct of more or less rays hitting a certain portion of the object. The sphere that is close by to the light source receives more rays than the sphere that is furthest away from the light source. And that's it. That's the light fall-off in a nutshell. Let's compare this light placement with the one in which our key light is moved much further away. Again, with retaining the power, with compensating the power and the size. Now the intriguing thing had happened. Look how flat is the lighting across the entirety of our objects and surfaces. There is practically no difference in exposures anymore in between four spheres and in between the near and far points on the floor, as if changing the distance in between the light source and the subject somehow unified the lighting across the scene. It is especially evident when juxtaposed with the first example, where light was essentially very close. So the relative distance in between the light and the subject and the background really matters. So I guess a takeaway tip is this. Keep your light source close if you want to play with the light fall-off effect. Of course, there are a few other properties of the key light that we haven't touched yet. The color temperature and propagation, to name a few. The easiest way to control the color of the light source is obviously to use the RGB color picker. A cinematography analogy would be placing a gel over the light source to make it any color you want. Or let's say using an RGB LED panels. So that was color wheel, the first option that we have. Alternatively, if you are in the mood of dealing with the color temperature directly, you can click the Use Nodes button, and then this dot near the color, and choose Black Body. The Black Body node converts the temperature in kelvins to the RGB data. Basically, this slider controls a type of radiation or light color emitted by a black body or light source when it's heated to a certain temperature. These temperatures are measured in Kelvin. The hotter the temperature, the more blue the light appears. The temperature of 5200 makes it look like a daylight. 6500 is slightly cooler than that. It's like an overcast daylight. So yeah, basically the higher the temperature, the bluer the color. It is a standard way of dialing in the color of the light source, of balancing the light bulbs in cinema production, you name it. With that being said, to keep things simple, I will remove this node for the time being and rely on our good old color wheel instead. I will dial in the neutral white color with the saturation of 0, or using the RGB model, it should be 1 in both red, green and blue. Okay. The last slider that we haven't explored yet is the beam shape spread. As its name implies, it's a tool for shaping the directionality of light, and it can be imagined as focusing the beam, basically. From the default 180 degrees all the way to 1 degree, which makes it super focused. It is also important to note that it does correlate with the perceived softness of light. The smaller spread value does make the shadows harsher. I think we're good with the default spread value of 180, so I'm gonna Control Z it all the way back. And let's imagine if we wanted to control the spread or propagation of the light beam, what else could we do? We could have used some kind of a blocker just a regular plain object or a box, we could have simply blocked or cut the part of the light rays to better control the propagation. Actually, we will dive deeper into shaping the beam of light later on in the course, in the second chapter, where we will use different kind of blocking techniques, as well as light textures and dappled light techniques. That is a little teaser, so obviously stay tuned. Meanwhile, because we utilize a physically plausible path tracing render engine, such as Cycles, we also automatically add some fill light in addition to our key light, just like it happens in a real-world production. So as we crank up the power of our directional light component, it also affects the power of the bounce. We can tell that the drop shadow part of the minerals isn't pitch black. It's because some part of the light rays got bounced or reflected by the environment. There are two types of bounces, diffuse and glossy, and if we dial in 0 in both, we will see what we would see in Eevee, let's say. We would see the pitch black shadow. And as soon as we bring back some of the light bounces and let Cycles do its light transport work, the shadow will get filled in a little bit. And it totally depends on the power of the light source. It works in proportion to the power of the key. I suppose it should be super intuitive and feel like home if you worked with physical light sources in production. And again, with no light bounces, it will look just like Eevee. So let's switch over to Eevee for a second, just for fun. To make it look indistinguishable from Cycles, the soft shadows in Eevee should be set to on. And then within the light settings tab, the contact shadows should be ticked. Otherwise, the shadows won't be precise enough. To double down on this, Cycles with 0 light bounces looks very similar to Eevee, but once the global illumination kicks in, Cycles path tracing gives us a nice fill in addition to the key light in the form of the indirect bounce. That being said, further down the line in the Monastery Dungeon chapter, to be exact, we'll discuss the global illumination methods for Eevee, namely its built-in irradiance map, as well as a real-time screen space global illumination, or SSGI. Consider this a quick teaser. Eevee is a great render engine after all, and it will get its time in the spotlight, no pun intended. Eevee is so cool, but still I'm gonna switch back to Cycles in a moment. Personally, I love a physically realistic way the secondary light bounces are calculated in Cycles. It's not that different from manipulating real light sources, and I think it just matches our learned expectation on realistic light transport, the secondary bounces specifically. It is a cool little effect that adds believability to everything, the photons bouncing around the scene and filling in the shadows. Well, not literally, but something like that. And the amount of the bounce light is again always in proportion to the amount of the directional light, and it makes the balancing of these two components really easy and intuitive. It's like a nice contrast ratio right out of the box. Okay, now I will dial back the power of our key lights to 3700 watts. Now everything about our main light feels right to me. We can start adding some detail, I think. Right now our key light is mainly represented by a pretty large and soft source, but that doesn't mean that we cannot throw in some directionality into it by making use of a much smaller pinpoint light source for extra glints and highlights. So again, this is our nice soft and big light source that is responsible for 90% of the image, for all the shapes and forms that we see. And I will move it to its own collection by pressing the M key. The collection will be called Light01. Now I will right click and duplicate this light source, hit S and make it much smaller, M to move it to its own collection called Light_02. This will be the extra component of our key light. Thinking about it, it will also serve the function of the hair light simultaneously, using the 3-point lighting terminology. We will talk about 3-point lighting later on. Let's just mention that three-point lighting is a fairly popular method for illuminating a subject with light sources from three distinct positions. The three types of lights are key, fill, and backlight. The key light is usually the brightest light, placed slightly off to the side to provide most important part of the lighting to our subject, revealing its form and dimension. The fill light to illuminate the shadow side. And the backlight, it's also called the hair light or the rim light, is used to pop the subject out of the background for a slightly more three-dimensional look. As we've said, this scheme is fairly popular in cinema, photography and CG lighting, so we'll be referring to it from time to time throughout this course. So getting back to the second light we have just added, it's the secondary key light, but at the same time it's the backlight that adds some extra separation to the objects in our 3D scene, so it kind of fulfills both of these functions. I mean, its main purpose will be to highlight the finer details in the silhouette as well as the glossier parts of the material. To add some extra separation with the main light, it can be slightly warmer. And by all means, it shouldn't be stronger than our main. Think of it as a supplementary touch, as just a little bit of glint on top of our main softness. So something like that. It can be slightly more focused in terms of the beam shape spread. Something like 70 degrees looks good to me. What I love about the smaller and harsher light sources is that they are good at capturing detail. It's something that the bigger and softer light sources don't necessarily achieve. And now, as a quick detour, let's quickly visit the Cycles render settings, untick the noise threshold and just input some value into the samples, like 128 samples in both render and the viewport. And also let's activate the denoiser. If there is one feature that was a total game changer in Cycles rendering, that's the denoising. A quick reminder that the options found here in the denoise settings will be dependent on the graphics card, and that while they give slightly different results, any option is better than none. So don't worry, just select whatever you like. Now that's a fantastic advice. Like, select anything you want. But really, OptiX is just as good as OpenImage Denoise. It is insane how smoother the rendering process gets with the use of denoising. I'm not even talking about the viewport. In my opinion, that just brings the dream of the real-time light transport and real-time path tracing much closer. So let's keep it activated. Denoising, I mean. It has its own minor performance price though. Without denoising, it's generally a little bit more responsive, the viewport I mean. With denoising, the overall effect is smoother, but the lag is still there. Alright, so here we created the compound light source. We can think about it as just one big key light, with just a little nuance, a little hint created by this smaller, sharper source embedded into it. The smaller light in this context is just complementary to the main one. I think it's the most productive way of thinking about it. Now here's how we can do quick comparisons to track our progress. What I'll do is set up two renders, with and without that second light. So let's toggle it off in the outliner temporarily. Okay, before giving it a quick render, allow me to visit the Blender settings, the preferences I mean. And in the user interface, let's make sure that within the temporary editors tab, the render in drop-down menu, the image editor is selected. It is a matter of personal preference, obviously, but personally I prefer to see the results in the Blender user interface when I hit the render button, without 3ds Maxing it with a bunch of new windows. Alright, so we have rendered the 1080p image. Now we can make a quick comparison. I'm switching to the second slot in the image editor and activating the second light component and hitting F12. That's a nice way of comparing before and after by switching back and forth between the slots. We can do it with using the number keys. 1, 2, 1, 2. See the glossy highlights popped out and being extracted by the secondary light source. Good job. Let's check a quick before and after. This is our extra light added into the mix, so it's worth recapping a few crucial points. First of all, our light hits the object from behind, so to speak. This seemingly innocent creative choice makes all the shadows fall in our direction, so effectively we now shoot into shadows. In other words, the camera is always standing on the shadow side. This is called the reverse key lighting or the upstage lighting. The other thing definitely worth mentioning is that our light source is brought in very close to the subject, to the scene, and so we can marvel at the light fall-off effect. That is, simply put, aesthetically pleasing. Well, we could have placed our light to the right or to the left as long as it's on the opposite side from the camera. It would still be the reverse key lighting, and we would still have some kind of a fill coming in from the camera side. So far it is a really balanced, really three-dimensional light setup. I love it. The next super exciting thing on our menu would be to throw the accent light or some pool of light somewhere so it adds visual interest to the scene. I see no reason not to use our trusty Blender Sun lamp for that. But first, let's right-click in the outliner and create a new collection called Sun_01. Then Shift-A, Light, and add in the sun lamp. It doesn't really matter where we position the sun lamp within the scene, because it shines from the infinitely far away point. So I'm just moving it around so it's conveniently placed in the viewport. What matters though is rotation. R to rotate, R and Z to rotate it along the Z axis, which is probably the most useful thing to do. It could be useful to temporarily disable all other light sources to concentrate purely on the rotation of the sun lamp. And yes, indeed, I'm sure you noticed that it is also placed in such a way to drop the shadows towards the camera, because why not? It just works. What we can do right away is warm up the color ever so slightly so it's closer to the yellowish and reddish portion of the color wheel, to simulate the evening sun or something like that. With our key light obviously imitating the window in this case. Okay, what about the strength? By default, the slider goes all the way to 10 and no further. What we can do to circumvent it is just click and type in any value we like. For example, 50 or 25 or 55 for that matter, or 100. Obviously, the sun can be a very bright light source indeed. How far we can push it depends on our creative goals in the end. But I wanted to pack a punch, so I will keep it in the higher range of strength. And without even noticing it, we have approached the topics of dynamic range, exposure, light ratios, and color management. Woohoo! Buckle up, it will be a 5-minute detour. I promise not to bore you too much, just a little bit. So, a quick experiment for you. Imagine that our sun lamp would be a terrifyingly powerful light source indeed, peaking at a whopping 1000 watts. It's a huge ball of fire after all. Alright, so what? So now it's an enormously powerful light source that would overpower all other light sources within the scene, but it got blown out. What we can do though to offset its brightness is to go down to the color management tab, find the exposure slider, and offset this slider by a few stops. By quite a lot of stops actually. So something like -6. It's like setting the ISO much lower in the camera, or playing with the shutter speed for that matter. So the sun is no longer as nuclear as it was before, but we have practically lost all other light sources by killing the overall exposure of our virtual camera. So this is the basic Blender relationship between the lighting intensity and the exposure. But there is also the view transform to keep in mind. Switch over to the standard one and these highlights will be completely gone. off the charts, clipped at white. And the higher you push this slider, the worse it gets. It is the way it is. It's how the standard view transform in Blender treats the highlights that are about to get clipped. So they get clipped. The filmic view transform preserves much more detail, especially in the highlights. It is much more sophisticated view transform. Thanks to Troy Sobotka, who has developed this view transform, and the AGX, even newer view transform as well. Check it out. Let's do a quick exposure sweep using standard and filmic. Look how the standard treats really intense pixels, and how with filmic we can still see some definition within the higher range. And the loss of data within the standard view transform gets even more prominent at -2. And when we climb all the way to 0, notice how the weird yellow coloring appears within the standard view transform, especially in the higher intensity areas. It is just weird. It's not how it should be. The filmic, on the other hand, holds very well even at the extreme exposures such as 5. The standard is officially wasted by now, while we still can see some detail within the filmic transform. That's the difference between those two models. The filmic is just better. It preserves more highlights, it is more versatile, it is more cinematic in that sense. More, well, filmic, because its compression of the scene-referred light values and the color gamut roughly emulates a photographic film aesthetic and matches our expectations from film emulsion-like media. That was a quick detour into the color management settings and the relationship between exposure and the light source intensity. Allow me to roll it back to exposure 0, the view transform set to filmic, that's important, and within the sun settings, the strength should be set back to what it was, 55 for example, which is still a lot of brightness, don't get me wrong. It still extends the dynamic range by quite a bit. I forgot to mention, we still keep this light source very sharp, like it probably should be. It is this sneaky ray of light that passes through the blinds or something like that, or through the leaves, and in just a moment we will tailor it to look just like that. So we have added a really prominent hard light into the mix, which was meant as an accent light. Now we need to use some kind of a light blocker or light gobo to really turn it into a light pool or light puddle. We just need to drag the viewer's eye into a certain portion of the image to create a bunch of pools of light. That is what we need. So let's create something that would block the light, a plane for example. I'm scaling it in such way so it can block a portion of the light coming in from the sun. And just in case, to avoid the unnecessary light spill, or rather light bounce, I'm creating a new material and assigning a black color to it. Also zeroing out the specular component just in case. S to make it bigger. G to move. What I'm trying to do here is constrain the area of effect, or rather area of influence of the sun lamp, so it turns into a little stream of light. Trying to find the right placement of the blocker. Shift D to duplicate it and move it over to the right side to leave a really small opening in between these two blockers. Now we can move this entire construction around to effectively shift the position of the light beam. I'm trying to avoid this beam touching the main mineral. I want it to be super soft, illuminated just with our key light. And in order to further tweak the shape of the opening, I'm using Shift D shortcut to duplicate the blocker once again. And you can see how moving it around affects the shape of the beam. Now the stroke looks alright. We can add some light texture to it. Now I'm going to simulate what is called a light gobo or a light cutout. This plane will serve as a base. I'm tabbing into the edit mode, creating a bunch of subdivisions with the help of the Ctrl-R shortcut. Then, selecting everything with the help of the A shortcut, right-click and subdivide everything a few times until the wireframe becomes fairly dense. Something like that. Control space to escape from the full screen mode, and then head over to the modifiers tab and select the decimate modifier. I'm going to use a fairly obscure way of rotating the geometry, so I'm selecting the unsubdivide mode and upping the iterations to 1. Now we can see that the geometry got rotated by 45 degrees, I believe. Yeah, 45 degrees, right? Now it's just a matter of throwing in the wireframe modifier and adjusting its thickness. We have effectively created the light gobo, and we can play with the light texture by adjusting the size of it. It's not super intuitive, but we can also control the harshness of the shadows by moving this object closer or further away from the light. Or I should have said closer or further away in relationship to our subject. Aside from purely aesthetic function of breaking up the light beam, this light gobo serves the purpose of hinting at the environment. Is it some decorative part of the blinds that is throwing such shadow? It tells something about the environment itself. I'm placing these objects into the sun blockers collection, just to keep things organized. And so this is our accent light. A stroke of compositional interest and a puddle of light at a higher intensity. There was nice and soft window somewhere, now there is a sunbeam striking through. Awesome! Generally speaking, one of the functions of lighting is to tell more about the setting, about the environment. The lighting choices you make help to hint at the environment properties and to ground your set into some kind of an ambient narrative. Such details as the light beam scattered through the leaves and hitting the table, the window shades, the color temperature even, all of those hints help to motivate our lighting setup and to ground it, even though we don't see the environment directly. Now allow me to digress and talk about the depth of field and anamorphic lenses. For me, the way the light gets distorted and scattered while passing through our virtual lens is an integral part of the whole lighting setup, and it's definitely an important part of our cinematography. So let's get into the camera settings while having the camera selected and activate the depth of field. Right away we can see that our camera focused on a certain point, and we can shift this point with the help of the distance slider. It works just like the focus ring on the lens. It works in a really physically plausible way because that's a path tracing render engine. And to not guess the distance, it's always easier to have a focus object somewhere in the scene, like this empty object here. The easy way to place one is to shift and right click to place a 3D cursor somewhere, then shift A and spawn an empty object. But I'll get rid of it because we already have one. Let's use it. It's called focus, so I'm clicking on the camera border to select it. Then down within the depth of field settings, I'm clicking on the eyedropper and selecting our focus empty. As for the lens aperture settings, we have the f-stop parameter that controls how closed or open is our aperture. The higher values produce the extended depth of field, very wide depth of field, and on the contrary, the lower values like 2.8 or even lower like 1.4 produce a very narrow depth of field, where a tiny portion of 3D depth is in focus and everything else is devoured by a creamy bokeh. We can fine-tune the bokeh shape by adjusting the number of the aperture blades. We'll see the effect in just a moment. And also adjusting the anamorphic ratio, where 1 is a perfectly spherical lens and 2 is a lens with an anamorphic squeeze. I'm gonna go with 1.6 for a balanced, slightly anamorphic look. The way that the anamorphic lenses work, aside from squeezing the out of focus elements, is that it leads to a widescreen aspect ratio, like 2.5 to 1, like 1920 by 816 pixels. Let's run a quick comparison now. Here is a perfectly spherical lens with the aperture ratio of 0 and the 8 blades aperture. Here we've bumped the aperture ratio to 2, meaning an anamorphic lens. It's still got a retro 8 blades aperture look. If it's an anamorphic lens, it should probably have a widescreen aspect ratio, to keep it historically accurate. And this pairing of the lens and the aspect ratio just looks cinematic. And finally, it should probably feature an anamorphic flare, but we won't go that direction yet. Now going back to our cinematic lighting formula to fill in an important gap, the fill light and how it helps to set a contrast ratio. So far, the only fill light in our scene was the bounce from our main light. If we wanted to reduce the overall contrast and fill in the shadows ever so slightly, we could go into the environment settings and boost the environment light strength. The fill lights are usually placed at the complementary angle to the key light to change the contrast of the lighting, but here we can get away with the omnidirectional environment light. And I would also warm up its tone, because I imagine this room to be of a warmer color due to the sunlight reflected and also implying the additional bounce from the table. In this case, a solid color for the environment is more than enough to control the fill, but if we wanted to make it fancier, we could have used one of the environments, let's say from Polyhaven, which I love. You can choose from many different 360 degrees spherical high dynamic range panoramas. All of them are free, and we will definitely explore this more sophisticated way of controlling the ambient light, among other things, in the next chapter. So that again was a teaser. Alright, when the key light was our only light source, some part of the scene simply didn't receive any exposure. After adding the fill light though, these underexposed shadowy areas can be, well, filled in, and that is essentially how we control the light versus dark contrast. Keeping the fill light pretty low leads to a dramatic change in exposure between lit and shaded parts. Something like 10:1 or 15:1. Such dramatic contrast between key and fill is called low-key lighting. On the other end of the spectrum, the fill light can become so strong that it can virtually eliminate all the shadows, or at least achieve much lower contrast ratios, something like 2:1. That's called the high-key lighting. So ultimately, it is all about increasing or decreasing the contrast ratio for the chiaroscuro contrasty look, or on the other hand for the high-key low contrast look, or any number of stops in between. You decide. My take on the balance between key and fill in this case is to aim for a medium contrast, maybe leaning towards the dramatic side of the spectrum, slightly towards low-key look. And now it's time for a quick digression. From my experience and the way I work, in every lighting project there comes a point when the basic light scheme is pretty much nailed for the most part, and you know it's good, and you are satisfied with it. Everything works together just fine. From there, it makes sense to change the perspective and give some love to materials before getting down to the lighting details. Materials in computer graphics dictate the way the light rays bounce off or travel through surfaces, and the influence of shaders on the overall look cannot be overestimated, so in this off-topic subplot, I guess we can try enhancing our materials with the subsurface light transport effect, and spend a few minutes casually talking about material properties in general. So we have strategically placed our key light behind the subject. Now, what if we allowed some part of this light to actually penetrate the translucent surface of this object and exit at some different point? I'm talking about the subsurface scattering effect, or subsurface light transport as it's called sometimes. As we have mentioned already, by default this effect was disabled in our demo scene. What we can do now is strike it back on by reconnecting the loose dot that you can find in the shader editor back into the subsurface scattering slot. Doing that will open the way for some really intriguing lighting calculations. What we need to do is select our main mineral and open the shader editor in the top window. You can press Shift F3 if you want to do it via shortcut. There you will find our principal BSDF shader with a subsurface socket and the loose dot that that needs to be dragged onto this socket. Subsurface scattering simulates semi-translucent objects in which light rays enter, bounce around, then exit in a different place. Aside from the subsurface slider that controls the amount of the effect, there is the subsurface radius drop-down menu where you can control the coloring or the tint of the effect. There are 3 channels there, red, green and blue, and you can tweak each one separately. For example, you can tweak the red one to increase or decrease the amount of red light scattered around. So yeah, basically that's how you give this mineral a sapphire, ruby or whatever else tint. Aside from the subsurface radius, there is one more parameter that allows us to tint the subsurface scattering effect, which is subsurface color. But I find it slightly hard to achieve really saturated colors. It's a little bit unpredictable, so that's why I resorted to use the subsurface radius instead. Now let's quickly explore the nodes that would go into the subsurface slot. I'm going to Ctrl-Shift to preview this node alone. And basically there is the color ramp that receives the original diffuse texture, that makes it black and white and adjusts the contrast of it. The brighter the color, the more scattering and vice versa. Now Ctrl-Shift back onto the principled BSDF. Okay, so it's a mechanism of tweaking the variable subsurface scattering. Then we should just grab the loose dot and hook it up into the subsurface input, and we should be good to go. The contrast can be tweaked by moving the flags closer to each other within the color ramp node, and the power of the effect can be tweaked by adjusting the tone or the value of these flags. For example, by making it darker, you will reduce the amount of scattering. So, one mineral done, a few more to go. I will go through every object one by one really quickly, except the table. So let's select this stone in the background, click on the dot and connect it to the subsurface input. Now do the same with this one, and the one in the foreground has no subsurface scattering, so no need to touch it. Here's how it looked before, and after subsurface scattering applied. Once again, the position of our main light complements the subsurface scattering effect so much, because not only the shadows fall in the direction of the camera, and the reflections go in that direction as well, but the light scattered through the stone also exits in the direction of the camera, if that makes sense. And it all clicks because of the position of the key light in the reverse key manner. Cool, right? Now, while we are reviewing our materials, let's go through other properties of our principled BSDF shader, just in case. What else do we have here that can be controlled? We have the specular slider that controls the amount of reflections. That can play a major role in how the object would look under certain lighting conditions. How many glossy rays in cycles does it reflect? That could be important. And the other really crucial thing is how glossy is it, or how diffuse is it on the other end of the spectrum. We have yet another color ramp here for controlling the glossiness or roughness, which is the same thing but inverted. You can play with the position of the flags to make the certain portions of the object look wet, for example. Let's disconnect this texture from the roughness input for a second. So basically, the low roughness means that the object is super glossy, surprise, and the higher roughness brings it closer to the perfect diffuse look. With the color ramp implemented, we achieve a so-called variable roughness, meaning that the certain portions of the object reflect the light in a more glossy manner, while the other are way more dull. The details like that may not seem like a big deal, but what is lighting in 3D if it's not interactions between the emissive surfaces and the materials, basically? So here comes the variable roughness color ramp. Ctrl-Shift to preview. Dark means glossy or even mirror-like if it's black. Bright means rough and diffuse. And then you control the contrast via the flags within the color ramp. Okay, shift-click on the main material. What else do we have here? The object can be metallic if the metallic slider is pushed all the way to the right. Or it can be a perfect dielectric material if the slider is set to 0. Lastly, if you feel like turning this object into a diamond, feel free to experiment with the transmission slider that controls the object translucency, how much light passes through the object. It works similar to subsurface scattering, but in a slightly different manner. It doesn't necessarily scatters the light around, it lets the light pass through just like glass. As they say, not everything is made of clay, and transmission shows just that. The transmission roughness controls how clear is the object transparency. At the higher values, it can make the interior or volume portion of the mesh seem murky, so that's what it does. Aside from that, there is a good old albedo texture or a diffuse texture at play that adds the base color to the object. Ctrl-Shift-Click to preview it really quickly. Yeah, that is the base color of the object that affects, among the other things, how much light bounces off that object. So that was a quick rundown of the properties of the mineral shader, principled BSDF, that can be tweaked alongside the subsurface scattering. I tried to keep the material fairly generic and fairly well balanced for the tutorial though. It has a little bit of everything, it's neither super glossy nor super rough. It has some subsurface scattering, it has some color, but not overwhelming amount of saturation in it. So that was a quick digression to bring the material and lighting interaction to the foreground for a second. That is important for 3D lighting. Now with that in mind, and with the added beauty of subsurface scattering, letting some light bounce around the object, let us return to our cinematic lighting setup and keep upgrading it. The next box in our cinematic lighting checklist is adding atmospheric haze. Haze is a really powerful tool that cinematographers use in movies to tame the dynamic range, to soften up the contrast, to make the light beams visible alongside other things. In order to haze this environment, first thing that we need to do is obviously add a new collection, name it fog_01, and then we'll need some kind of a box, a container. I'm gonna add a cube, scale it up so it encompasses all the objects within the scene. It's a shame it blocks the view entirely, so I'm gonna jump into the Object Properties menu, and in the Display drop-down, select Bounds. Then it's a matter of setting up a new material, which will actually be the volume material. Let's get into the shader editor first. Then delete the default principled BSDF, go Shift-A, shader, and add the principled volume shader. Plug it right here all the way, and lower the density considerably. We just need to fill our room up with haze ever so slightly, so I think the density could be pretty low, something like 0.1 or 0.05 even. I'm just looking for this kind of ethereal glow rather than the Silent Hill fog. Okay, the anisotropy value controls the scattering of the volume material. It is pretty hard to put in words. We'll have a look at a few examples later on. Let's crank up the density all the way to 0.2 to make the anisotropy effect visible. Thinking about it, I would put it like that, and I'm not sure how precise is this explanation of anisotropy and what's actually going on, but I feel that the higher anisotropy values kind of shift the scattering of the volume shader towards the light source. Let's say at 0 it's a totally uniform scattering, and at 0.75 and higher we start to see how it shifts towards our area light here. And at the negative values, it kind of moves it away from the light source. I know this explanation may sound a little bit murky. In theory, the higher anisotropy values might look like smoke and steam, while the lower, even negative anisotropy values might look like dust. The best way to know it is to play with it yourself, I guess. I'm setting the density back to 0.05, or even lower than that. Yeah, I think that looks good. It's this kind of enhancement to the depth and overall dimension of the scene that allows the foreground objects to pop out. It sets up different tiers of contrast throughout the scene. Here we have a dark foreground, and then a still pretty high contrast within the midground figure, which is our mineral pack, then a totally washed out backdrop, which has a relatively low contrast in between the shaded and lit areas. The midground contrast ratio is much more abrupt. It just naturally makes these objects closer to the camera stand out, just due to the contrast levels. That's probably one of the major things about this image. And there is something very prominently cinematic about this combination of the extra depth and dimension created by the haze, and at the same time the extra readability of the center of interest. That is a powerful stuff. And of course, with the harder light sources like our sunshine, it allows us to see the beam, to see the beamage or beaminess. That is also called light shafts and God rays. Nice beautiful rays of sunshine that give texture to the volume or space we are in. So that was atmospheric haze, one more component of our cinematic lighting formula. What's next? So the main pillars of our lighting formula have already been put into place. Now we can play with the details. How about spicing it all up with some dust particles? Such atmospheric enhancements to our lighting setup is the perfect opportunity to enhance the sense of place that we try to recreate on set, to add the markers of authenticity and believability, which is as important in CG graphics, if not more important, than in classical cinematography. Before we pepper up our beautiful sunbeams with dust, I think I'll toggle off the visibility of the fog layer to make it slightly more performant in terms of viewport speed. So I've added a new collection called Dust. Now I'm going to teleport to one of the project files included with the course, namely the blend file with the dust effect. Here we can see a classical dust imitation technique implemented, a particle texture applied to material transparency. What we can do without diving deep into its material settings is just select the plane. It is a one polygon plane indeed. So with the plane being selected, now Ctrl+C, copy objects, navigate back to our gorgeous mineral scene, and then Ctrl+V to paste it. Now, if everything went right, the transparency should show up in both the material preview and rendered modes. What I'll try to do with this fake particle sprite now is put it in such way so it falls right into focus, so the viewer can technically appreciate the intricacies of this thing. For the convenience's sake, I have switched temporarily to the material preview mode to work in real time. And so it feels like it should be in focus now. As for the shader, it's nothing more than the alpha texture applied to a plane, really, and some neutral colored emission that probably shouldn't go over the top. It is meant as a fairly subtle effect to sell the sunshine that passes through the particles, passing through the air. Like every other such effect, it shouldn't jump straight in our faces. It should be used in a minimal way. I think what I'll do is turn down the emission strength considerably, so it's barely visible but still visible, you know what I mean? And I will also infuse some pitchiness into the emission tint to make it look like it's illuminated by our sun lamp indeed, which has this warmer property to its color. I think it's still a little bit too crude. I will reduce the emission strength furthermore. Now it looks to me like it could help us indeed to sell the effect of the sunbeams passing through the denser air. That's good. Maybe we can press Shift-D a few times to create a few layers of dust to make it more three-dimensional. Let's say one placed in the backdrop and the other one barely touching the lens, so we see the nice out-of-focus circles of bokeh. Cool. So Shift-D again. That is the third dust plane that we have created. I wonder, can you see these blurred highlights that look almost like the lens dirt? I think the aberrations like that is such a nice touch, both in terms of selling the atmosphere and just for its aesthetic pleasure. It reminds me of real photography, where you capture such things even if you don't want it. Sometimes it just happens naturally. and we have to simulate it all from scratch. It is not fair, not fair. And to remove the anamorphic squeeze, feel free to reset the aperture ratio to 1. But personally, I adore the horizontal squeeze effect of the out-of-focus elements. It gives away the cinematic vibe by association with the real anamorphic lenses. It's just beautiful, I think. So let's keep it anamorphic and turn back the fog layer on while we are on it. It is fair to say that one of the functions of lighting is to enhance this sense of place, to help sell the location's believability by adding those small and not so small details. Unfortunately for us 3D lighting gaffers, there is a performance cost associated with stacking layers on top of layers on top of layers. The more volumetric we go in terms of adding fog and the more transparency layers we stack, the harder it becomes for Cycles to render. So if you feel that at this point your computer started struggling with it, feel free to toggle some layers off temporarily. For example, the haze layer. Then, when needed, you'll toggle it back on just for a second, have a look, toggle it back off until the final render, where you enable all bells and whistles. Probably the last enhancement on our bucket list of cinematic lighting enhancements for today is lens flares. The lens flare occurs when the hard light bounces around the lens barrel. It is considered by some cinematographers as a mistake even, and others adore it. For us CG makers, it's a nice way to balance out the image so it doesn't feel overly sharp, not to mention that it unifies the composition together, and adds that authenticity and grittiness to the image, the kind of grittiness that helps to ground our CG lighting elements in some photographic truth. We will explore the technique that doesn't involve any third-party add-ons for Blender, but that being said, there are some awesome lens flares add-ons that you can find on Blender Market that may help you to recreate this beautiful optical light aberration within the lens. So the paid add-on path is definitely worth considering if you want to have access to the ready-made presets and stuff like that. And meanwhile, we will simulate this awesome photographic phenomenon using the vanilla Blender tools. Without a further delay, I'm gonna navigate to one of the project files, one of the blend files with a lens flare effect. And in just a moment, I will copy-paste it into our mineral scene, and it will probably look gorgeous right out of the box. But first, let's see how the shader is set up. Here's a trick for achieving the non-occluding additive effects, such as flame or lens flares for that matter. What we do is add two shaders together, like the emission and transparent BSDFs here, using the Add Shade node in Cycles. This makes the material look like pure emission without actually occluding anything. Right, so Ctrl-C, copy objects, then jumping right back into our scene. And after creating a new collection, obviously named flares_01, I'm gonna paste the flare, so Ctrl-V. But the question is, where should it be located in the scene? Again, the excess optical aberration such as lens flare occurs right inside the lens barrel when hard light enters it and bounces around unpredictably. In other words, it happens right near the sensor. Of course, this presumption, like any other rule in computer graphics, can be broken, but generally we would want this lens flare object to sit right on top of our camera object. So I'm selecting the lens, then shift-click on the camera, Ctrl-C, and copying out its location and rotation. So the plane with our lens flare occupies the same position in space as the camera sensor, and then we can press G and Z 2 times to move it back and forth alongside its local Z axis. This is the easier way to slide it back and forth to control the proximity to the sensor. What we can do then is flood the entire top portion of the screen with this anamorphic streak by scaling it up. And it's up to you whether you want a soft glow or a totally overpowering cinematic lens flare, J.J. Abrams style. Well, some cinematographers and 3D artists for that matter like to keep the picture as pristine and digital and clinical as possible without mistakes or artifacts like lens flares, but chances are maybe you are from the other camp. Alright, because I want to give it a certain tint, I'm adding the mix node in between the lens flare texture and the emission shader. And what I'm doing here is multiplying the lens flare texture by this orangey color. Or if you wish, so you can you can make it a classic blue anamorphic sci-fi streak. Personally, I don't want to mess with the warmer color palette of this image, so I will probably keep it yellowish, orangish. I think this optical aberration really helps to unify the lighting in our scene somehow. It not only tames the contrast and brings all colors together a little bit, it also, how should I put it, helps us to tap into the photographic truth behind the image formation. The gorgeous light flood artifact is not only aesthetically pleasing, at least in my opinion, it also connotes the real construction of the lens elements, you know, that there are some sophisticated lens elements stacked into layers, letting the light bounce around it. This suggestion alone that there are a bigger picture at play adds a much needed depth into our CG lighting formula, and the presence of such layers of depth is just cinematic. Alright, awesome, so that was the last minute addition to our bucket list of cinematic lighting techniques for rendering any kind of still lifes and object shots. Now it's time to go through the render settings, render this thing out, and then recap the steps that we have taken throughout this tutorial. I hope it was a lot of fun rather than frustration to use this Cycles path tracing right within the viewport. There is definitely a performance gradient depending on the GPU. Anyway, denoising should help with lowering the render times greatly, so we have the denoising turned on. And as for the light bounces, I think for the final render we can crank it up ever so slightly. It will make a minor visual difference, if any, but anyway, we can do it. Then, as a precaution to not lose the precious ray traced lighting details, I usually increase the indirect light clamping amount. This is my kind of personal superstition in Cycles, because the default value of 10 more often than not is no different than 50 or 100. The indirect light intensities or values pretty rarely go above the threshold of 10 anyway, so nothing really gets clamped. But if it was, it would look like that. See? Probably that's why I feel that typing in 50 there is safer. 0 completely removes the limit, so feel free to go with 0 instead, if you feel like it. Filter glossy at its default value. What else do we have here worth talking about? The number of samples for the final render can obviously be slightly more ambitious. 256. Currently the resolution is set to 1912 to 816 pixels wide. The percentage field can be used to decrease or increase this amount. I think we should be good to go. We can hit this render button. Oh yes. We will wrap it up here and have a look at the compositor and where we can take this lighting setup in the next tutorial. It'll be all about taking the scene-referred lighting information that we are rendering out currently and passing it over to the Blender compositor, adding post-processing to it, maybe color grading it a bit, to extend our cinematic lighting workflow into the post-processing zone ever so slightly. And now let's do a quick recap. As a method, we have chosen to build our lighting formula from scratch, from darkness. Then right away we have placed a pretty big and soft light very close to our scene on the opposite side from where our camera stands, to make sure that we shoot into shadows. This placement of the key light is sometimes called the reverse key light or upstage lighting in cinematography. Not stopping there, we have enhanced our bigger and softer main light with the help of the smaller pinpoint light source to help bring out the fine details. The glints and highlights said thank you. Then, caring about the cinematic vibes, we accommodated the narrow depth of field and the anamorphic widescreen aspect ratio. The next step was to allow the much hotter and harder light streak to hit our scene to create the pool of visual interest and to hint at the possible environment. Not to mention the perception of dynamic range that it brings to our picture with the help of the hot highlights. And I wonder if you agree, it helps to motivate everything. It just makes us feel the window and the weather behind it even. The next logical step after setting up the key light was to control the amount of fill in the shadows to ultimately control the contrast ratio and to be able to choose between the low key and the high key look and all the variations in between. After we got the light basics right, we happily digressed into material enhancements, namely by introducing some subsurface scattering and allowing the light rays from the sun and from the key light to actually go through the translucent surface of the minerals and exit on the other side for a nice light rub effect, which by happy accident complemented our original reverse key light scheme very nicely indeed. Then we fired our haze machine to achieve a cinematic separation of objects, to make the foreground objects pop, and just to give texture to the volume or space we were shooting in. It naturally and very fortunately set the planes apart in terms of contrast ratios in between the background and midground and foreground objects. And then to crank it to 11, we made sure that our sunbeams actually catch some dust particles as well, including the beautiful foreground bokeh elements elongated by the use of the anamorphic squeeze. All because we care about this sense of place. And lastly, we shamelessly blasted it with the lens flare artifact, which helped to unify the colors and bring in some photographic truth into it. So this is it for the first chapter of the cinematic lighting course that you are watching right now. My name is Gleb Alexandrov, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.